Chapter 281. Balzac Ludbeth 1. The deputy chieftain had died, and the chieftains of the other tribes who had been conspiring with him had all had their left arms torn off in a show of camaraderie. A section of the city walls had also collapsed, and some of the warriors who had been lining the walls nearby were also caught up in the collapse and had been injured. Even with all that, none of the warriors of the tribes thought to rebel against Ivatar. Even the elders of the tribe who had most likely sided with the deputy chieftain in his absence, politely greeted Ivatar and the rest of the party. This was all because Ivatar had crushed the deputy chieftain in a head-on duel before killing him, as well as tearing off the arms of the other chieftains. While this might not have been the case if this were any other country on the continent, the tribes of this forest valued strength above all else. So once Ivatar, who had earned the right to be the chieftain's successor, showed his strength by killing the deputy chieftain, who possessed a similar level of legitimacy, it was only natural that there wouldn't be any backlash against his rule. He's strong, Cyan thought as he reconsidered Ivatar. Though in the first place Cyan had never thought of Ivatar as just a simple native with only his huge size going for him. Cyan possessed a skilled enough eyesight that he could evaluate an opponent's ability. So he had recognized that Ivatar possessed enough skill that even when compared to the Lionheart Knights, he would be able to rank as one of the captains. No, not just an ordinary captain but one of the strongest among them. However, now that Cyan had seen a true display of Ivatar's skills, he felt he needed to rate Ivatar even higher than he already had. Even among all of the knights of the continent that Cyan had seen during the night march, how many of them would be able to say that they were stronger than Ivatar? Even the tribal chieftains who had conspired with the Zoran tribe's deputy chieftain would have been able to earn a place as the commander of a country's knightly order if they were to move to the continent. He might be built like a brick shithouse. But he's actually the same age as Eugene and I, Cyan recalled. When he also took Ivatar's age into consideration, Cyan felt like even more of a waste in comparison. Yet the reality of this was unavoidable. After all, Eugene was a monster who had been evaluated as the most talented individual in all of the Lionheart clan's history, and this Ivatar Jahav was also someone who could arguably be counted as one of the strongest tribal warriors, not just within the confines of the Zoran tribe, but in all of this vast rainforest. Once again you're getting all mopey, Eugene said with a sigh as he saw Cyan's expression stiffen unnaturally. At this comment, Cyan turned to face Eugene while feeling a flare of anger. What did I do? Eugene replied calmly, it's obvious. After seeing Ivatar's skills, you must have thought, why am I so weak, right? Is my expression really that easy to read? Cyan thought as he contorted his expression and touched his own face. Eugene continued, do you know just how many people there are in the whole wide world? If you were to line up everyone among the humans with a talent for fighting, then the ones who would be close to the top of the list, well, they would most likely be the famous knights you're already familiar with. From the Lionheart clan, that would probably be the patriarch Lady Carmen and myself. Cyan silently waited for him to get to his point. Ivatar has the same level of talent and skill. To put it clinically, while you and Seal can get close to the top, reaching the peak will be difficult for you, Eugene stated bluntly. You don't say. Cyan huffed. Eugene coughed. Of course, while this is just the plain and simple reality of the situation, reality doesn't always work out the way it seems it should. What I mean is, among the great heroes who I admire and venerate. Ahem. Just as Eugene was about to finish speaking, Mare, who was standing beside them, cleared her throat loudly and turned to stare at Eugene with narrowed eyes. Eugene hesitated before continuing, I'm talking about Sir Hamel. You know, he seemed surprisingly ordinary at the very beginning, right? Compared to the heroic feats that he eventually accomplished, that is. He might have made quite an impressive name for himself as a mercenary, but in fact Sir Hamel at that time was far from being a great hero. I already know this story. Sir Hamel, who wasn't really all that strong, quickly became stronger after becoming a member of the Great Vermouth's party, Cyan said with a snort. However, Sir Hamel was only able to become stronger because Sir Vermouth was at his side. Sir Vermouth guided Sir Hamel and... This time it was Eugene's turn to interrupt. Who the fuck said that? It wasn't like that though. Sir Hamel never received any guidance from Sir Vermouth. Sir Hamel got stronger because he worked hard all by himself. Rhaenyra, who was standing with Mare, also turned to stare at Eugene with narrowed eyes. Similarly, Eugene chose to ignore her gaze. It's also, thanks to the fact that he went through so many battles. Sir Hamel's innate talent. At first it was like a flower that had yet to bloom. After experiencing many battlefields, the flower fully bloomed from the repeated battles. Eugene wasn't just speaking randomly. Even in Eugene's own esteemed opinion, that was just how his past self had been. He might have already made quite a name for himself as a mercenary, but there was no comparison between the battlefields on the continent and the battlefields within the Devildom. Yet if he had gone to Helmuth without meeting Vermouth and becoming a member of his party, I would probably have been dead within a few years, Eugene silently admitted to himself. As for whether he had received any guidance from Vermouth, he had to admit there had been a few times. However, in Hamel's opinion, rather than the guidance, it was more the fact that there was a monster like Vermouth standing right next to him that stimulated his growth. He hadn't wanted to lose to Vermouth. He had always wanted to become stronger than Vermouth. All along, that was what Hamel had been most obsessed with. I think I get what you're trying to say, but just what on earth do you see me as? Cyan asked, his face still fixed in a frown. However, seeing how his slumped shoulders had straightened out at some point during their talk, it was clear that Eugene's encouragement had helped him. I might have been made keenly aware of how strong you and Ivatar are, but that doesn't mean my spirit has died, Cyan proudly insisted. I've already experienced that kind of frustration back in the snowfields. It hasn't had any effect on me. Because of his pride, Cyan couldn't bear to honestly thank Eugene for his encouragement. And as he had just admitted, Cyan had already felt how thoroughly weak he actually was back in the snowfields. He also knew that continuing to obsess over that fact wouldn't be of any help to his growth. Eugene and Ivatar were strong. Cyan was weaker. However, what did it matter? Cyan didn't think his future self would also be weaker than them. Really, even though your brother is doing his best to encourage you, what's with the attitude? Eugene said, feeling a needless sense of embarrassment as he kicked Cyan in the leg. It was around sunset when Ivatar finally returned from the battle planning. When he opened the door of the room and walked in, Ivatar's appearance had completely changed from how he had looked earlier. He was now wearing a helmet made from the whole skull of some beast, and he was also wearing an ornate, clinking array of necklaces and bracelets. Lovelian was the first to greet him. It looks like you've officially become the chieftain. Congratulations. With a wry smile, Ivatar bowed his head as he stepped into the room. Among all the changes in his appearance, the most eye-catching was the large tattoo that had been newly applied onto his chest. Even though it couldn't have been that long since it had been tattooed, Ivatar's skin looked perfectly healthy instead of red and swollen, but there was still a strong smell of blood. But the bloody odor wasn't coming from the tattoo. Glancing down at Ivatar's large hands, Eugene asked, "Did you come here after killing someone?" "I came here after killing some pathetic old men," Ivatar admitted. Eugene snorted. "To think you would start with a purge right after becoming the chieftain." Ivatar shook his head. "Even if I didn't become the chieftain, I still would have had to kill those fools." It was just as Eugene had guessed earlier. The young warriors were looking forward to the battle. However, the late deputy chieftain, the chieftains of the allied tribes, and even some of the elders of the Zoran tribe had already given up on winning this war. While they might also have once been warriors who bravely raced through the forest and yearned for battle, now that they had grown older and had gotten their hands on more than they could hold, rather than risking death on the battlefield, they would rather die at a comfortable old age. "It was something they decided on while I was away," Ivatar explained. "They had agreed to lead their forces into repeated defeats, sacrificing enough blood and souls until the Cochilla tribe was satisfied. After that, they would surrender and become part of the Cochilla tribe." Naturally, Ivatar didn't agree with any of this. As a young and belligerent man, Ivatar wanted to win this war. Most of the tribal warriors felt the same way. "I've been told that a few more battles took place while I was away. For tribes have already been destroyed, and the Cochillas have trampled all the way into the forest to the north of the Zoran tribe," Ivatar reported as he unfolded the large animal pelt that he had been holding in one hand and hung it on the wall. Eugene had been wondering what Ivatar was holding, but it turned out to be a map of the forest. Ivatar narrowed his eyes as he stared at the map. "If my memories are still correct, then the location of the World Tree and the Elven territory should be around here," Ivatar said as he stuck a huge awl into the map. It might be called the World Tree, but that didn't mean the tree itself was located in the exact center of the rainforest. Instead, it was actually located quite far west of the approximate center. Of course, it wasn't like the World Tree was truly at that site. To be more precise, the World Tree existed within a separate dimension that overlapped that location. Then from this point outwards, this is the territory of the Coachella tribe, Ivatar explained as he stuck another awl in a place that was far away from the World Tree. Eugene felt a little relieved by this. While it would be impossible to open the barrier that had been placed over the site unless you had the leaves from the World Tree with you, Eugene still felt the need to be cautious. These are the places that have been conquered, Ivatar resumed speaking as several more awls were stuck into the map. Eugene, who watched silently until Ivatar was done sticking awls in all of the locations, nodded and said, "This isn't just a simple war of conquest. If the Coachillas had just wanted to expand their territory, they could have just swallowed the land of the tribes surrounding them first." In fact, several of the awls had indeed been inserted around the Coachella tribe's main territory, but many other awls had also been inserted far from their tribal grounds. "I also agree with that opinion," Ivatar said, nodding. Loveline and, surprisingly, Melkith both had serious expressions as they examined the map together. The two archwizards were certain that this war was simply a precursor to the casting of a huge black magic spell. "Allow me to put forward a certain assumption," Loveline eventually spoke up. "As a wizard, you need to be able to distinguish between spells that you can control and spells that you can't. However, all wizards will eventually dream of casting greater feats of magic that they know that no individual would actually be able to control. In those cases, the caster needs to look for other means in order to fulfill their own shortcomings. Those means aren't necessarily limited to providing sacrifices or making contracts with higher-ranked beings." Melkith took over the explanation. "There's this thing known as the earth veins. The term refers to the circulating flow of the mana within the land itself. Wherever the mana in the earth veins is particularly abundant, those places come to be known as ley lines, but such ley lines are extremely rare." Loveline resumed speaking. "I believe that most of the lands that the Coachillas have conquered are located over branches of the earth veins. The black wizard behind all this must be planning to use some trick so that they can make use of the mana flowing through the earth veins." "That son of a bitch Balzac," Eugene spat. Loveline blinked in surprise at this sudden curse before hesitantly giving his opinion. "I personally believe that Balzac isn't the one behind this. We can't be sure of that yet. So for now, let's assume that Balzac is the one behind all this," Eugene proposed. Loveline couldn't quite bear to curse Balzac without any justification whatsoever like Eugene had just done. With a cough, Loveline changed the subject. "Of course. This is all just speculation for now. In my opinion, I would like to leave here immediately and check what is going on at those sites with my own eyes. We've finished our preparations for the march ahead," Ivatar reported. "As long as I give the order, all assembled warriors will march on the Coachella tribe. That's quite the quick and easy solution. While pushing them back from the land that they've captured, step by step, it will all be over once we strike at the heart of the Coachella tribe," Eugene said optimistically. "As for the black magic, it might be possible for us to purify it on our own once we're done," Loveline agreed. As this conversation went on around him, Cyan clenched his fists nervously as he felt the reality of the war dawning on him. Mare didn't really have an interest in this talk that had nothing to do with her, so she was engrossed in playing rock-paper-scissors with Rhaenyra in a corner of the room. Someone suddenly knocked on the door. "One moment, please," Ivatar said, begging everyone's pardon as he turned towards the door. After exiting the room for a few moments, Ivatar returned with a puzzled expression. Ivatar then declared, "Balzac Ludbeth has turned himself in." "What did you just say?" Eugene demanded. Ivatar repeated himself, "Balzac Ludbeth has turned himself in." Everyone assumed the same confused expression that Ivatar already sported. Even after hearing the news directly, they still couldn't believe it. However, once they saw him with their own eyes, they were left with no choice but to accept the truth. This was one of the three mages of incarceration, Aratha's Black Tower Master, a black wizard whose intentions were unknown and whose very behavior was suspicious, as well as the prime suspect for being the black wizard behind all of this. Yet having been tied up, Balzac Ludbeth was led into the room by a few warriors. Even the robe Balzac had initially been wearing upon his surrender had been taken off, and all his weapons had also been confiscated. A long sword with a black blade for daggers, a pocket artifact that was enchanted with spatial magic, and his magic staff. Even the glasses that Balzac was always wearing had been taken from him, and his shoes were also stripped, leaving him barefoot. Both hands had been bound so they couldn't move, and his mouth had also been gagged to prevent him from casting any incantations. It was quite a pathetic appearance. Upon being led into the room, Balzac's first action was to bow his head to everyone. Thanks to the gag between his lips, he couldn't say anything to greet them. Still flustered by this surprise, Eugene pointed at Balzac and demanded, "What the hell are you up to?" Unable to reply, Balzac could only smile wryly. After sending the warriors who had led Balzac here back out of the room, Ivatar turned to look back at Eugene and hesitantly asked, "Do we need to torture him?" Balzac shook his head at this. Eugene's brow furrowed and he raised a finger. A sharp blade of wind tore out the gag between Balzac's lips. "Long time no see," Balzac said in greeting as soon as his mouth was freed. Eugene's brow furrowed once more. For a moment he considered whether he should slice apart the restraints binding Balzac's hand or if he should just aim for Balzac's throat. "Why have you come here?" Lovelian asked after he had recovered from his surprise. To think that Balzac would suddenly turn himself in. Since Balzac was someone whose true intentions were difficult to scry, even this action might be part of a scheme leading up to something else. Melkith had already made preparations to summon one of her spirit kings, and Christina had also grabbed the handle of her flail. "The one manipulating the Coachella tribe is Edmund Codrith," Balzac confessed. That didn't answer why he was here. Even though Lovelian had been prepared to cast a spell that would incinerate Balzac's body as soon as he said something that wasn't an answer to Lovelian's question, in the end, Lovelian couldn't cast the spell that he had prepared and was left gaping open-mouthed. "Edmund has dispatched his elite forces to occupy Samar's earth veins, and the goal of this war is to interfere with the flow of mana below," Balzac continued to reveal. "Hold on," Lovelian tried to pause for thought. Balzac hastily continued. "Edmund has already made quite a lot of progress towards his goal. Once the spell is complete, Edmund will become a demon king." This news left everyone speechless. Christina also unconsciously leaped to her feet and Eugene's eyes darkened coldly. Demon king. They had had their suspicions. However, deep down they had thought that it was impossible. It was just a special case. The remnants of the demon kings lingering within the demonic spear and the annihilation hammer were only able to prepare such a ritual by focusing their attentions on whispering into Yuad's ear and corrupting him. On that day, the remnants of the demon kings that had appeared at the Black Lion Castle had been completely annihilated. Even if the spell had been leaked by the now-deceased Hector, it should still be impossible to become a demon king by casting that spell unless there were still some remaining remnants of the demon kings. Eugene expressed his doubts. "That should be impossible." "It would be impossible for someone like myself," Balzac corrected. "It would be impossible even for Amelia Merwin. However, if it's Edmund, then it's very much possible. Because he possesses the Vladimir and is making use of the many advantages that he has prepared within this forest." Lovelian composed himself. "For now, Black Tower Master, please answer the question. Why have you come here? Why did you surrender yourself?" "In regards to my surrender, it's just as you can see. I gave myself up in order to cooperate with Sir Eugene and the rest of you." Balzac stopped speaking for a few moments to examine everyone's expressions. "This might offend you all, but I was personally keeping an eye on you as you approached the capital of the Zoran tribe. That was due to the fact that I was keeping an eye on the Zorans because of their war with the Coachillas." Balzac had familiars assigned to perform surveillance duties hidden all over the Zoran tribe. He had also witnessed the commotion that had occurred earlier at the city walls. "Cooperation," Eugene repeated as he glared into Balzac's face with narrowed eyes. "I don't think I can trust that offer. After all, how do I know that anything you've said is the truth? If that's the case, then how about just listening to me for now? Then you can go and check out the truth for yourself once I'm done telling you everything. If it's the Red Tower Master and the White Tower Master, they should be able to tell whether I am telling the truth just by examining the earth veins that have been occupied by the Coachilla tribe," Balzac counteroffered. Eugene frowned. "What reason would you have for betraying Edmund?" Sir Eugene, that accusation is mistaken." Balzac shook his head with a sigh. "Edmund and I aren't in a relationship close enough for there to be any betrayal. After all, I have never been all that supportive of Edmund's goals from the very beginning. In the first place, Edmund doesn't even know I've come to this forest." Balzac stopped speaking for a few moments as he was lost in thought. He eventually continued, "However, he should have found out by now. After coming to this forest, I've been making sure to move extremely carefully, but I probably exposed my presence when I surrendered to the Zoran tribe. Are you saying that the Cochillas have eyes within the tribe? Ivatar growled. Without showing any signs of shrinking back as Ivatar's massive frame stomped over to his side and glared down at him, Balzac calmly replied, "It would be strange if there weren't any. Please don't worry too much. After this conversation is over, I can reveal all of the eyes that Edmund has stationed within your capital. If it's a problem for you to have been seen by those eyes, you should have approached us secretly. So why did you choose to surrender yourself publicly?" Eugene questioned. "I thought that if I tried to approach you secretly, there would be a high probability of getting killed by a blind stroke of Sir Eugene's sword," Balzac honestly confessed. "Also, I believe that it would be much better for me to surrender myself and cooperate with you, Sir Eugene, than it would be for me to stay undercover." "Better for who exactly?" Eugene demanded. "Of course it's for all of us. Once he knows that you are here, Sir Eugene, and he finds out that I've joined you as well, then even Edmund, who's known for always being cool and composed, will start to get nervous. Especially since that guy, despite how I'm describing him, we really aren't that close. It's just that I don't really have anything else to say, so I was just speaking as I normally do." Balzac quickly excused himself. "That's enough, so why would Edmund become nervous because of this?" Eugene prompted. "It's because the two of us have both signed a contract with the Demon King of Incarceration," Balzac said in a serious tone. "Edmund will be sure that I am up to something. He has to be wary about the possibility that the spell he has worked so hard to prepare might be usurped by me, so he will try to complete the ritual in a hurry even if his preparations don't quite measure up yet." Eugene frowned. "You say that like it would be a misunderstanding on Edmund's part, but that might just be your true intention. If that was really the case, then why would I have come here?" Balzac pointed out. Eugene felt that Balzac was telling the truth. If he truly did intend to usurp control of Edmund's black magic, there would be no reason for him to come here. Instead, it would make more sense for him to stay hidden the whole time, only revealing himself at the moment that Eugene clashed with Edmund, stealing control of the spell for himself. "I can swear on my very being and my soul." Balzac's voice resonated with the heavy tones of a magical oath. "I have no intention of becoming a demon king. I would rather remain as the existence known as Balzac Ludbeth, a human being. I long to live as a human and die as a human." Eugene fell silent. "As to the reason I've come here, it's for the sake of stopping Edmund from becoming a demon king," Balzac said with a smile as he faced Eugene. "And to do that, I intend to help the hero, Sir Eugene." These didn't feel like the words that a black wizard should say. Chapter 282, Balzac Ludbeth II. With a wary look still in his eyes, Eugene stared at Balzac. Although the words that Balzac had said just now didn't seem like something a black wizard should say, Balzac was still ultimately a black wizard. There was no way that Eugene could trust a black wizard such as Balzac, especially in a situation like this. However, Balzac had sworn a magical oath. While you couldn't say it never happened, it was still extremely rare for a wizard to make such an oath. This was because from the moment such an oath left their lips, strong restrictions would be placed on any actions that they took from then on. There was no way that a black archwizard like Balzac wouldn't be aware of this. Nevertheless, Balzac had still spat out such an oath casually and without any second thoughts. Was he that certain that all his future behavior wouldn't go against this oath? While this might be the case with how suspicious of Balzac he was, Eugene couldn't help but think that it had to be something else. For example, the oath was fake. As a black wizard, Balzac might just have some secret plan that would allow him to ignore the consequences of a magical oath. "You look like you don't believe me," Balzac said with a wry smile. Eugene snorted and replied, "I've already said this to you many times, but I believe that the only good black wizard in the world is a dead black wizard." Balzac cocked an eyebrow. "Could it be that meeting me here like this is so unpleasant that you're abandoning all pleasantries? What's the point of being careful with my words when speaking to a bastard who might stab me in the back?" Eugene retorted. "I'm only being so polite with you because you haven't stabbed me in the back yet. If you had, I'd probably be calling you a son of a bitch." "I would prefer it if you didn't," Balzac requested. "I hold great pride in myself as a human being." Eugene recalled the conversation that he had had with Balzac in Arath. At that time, Balzac had been curious about the ritual that had taken place at the Black Lion Castle. But Eugene hadn't revealed anything about the spell itself. Instead, he had only informed Balzac about the purpose of the ritual. Reconstructing the soul and creating a new body. Something like that might be regarded as taboo in the field of magic, but it is a research direction that has been pursued by many black wizards. It's not a topic that interests me all that much. Reconstruction of the soul eventually leads to transforming your soul into something else. And the creation of a new body would also require me to change the vessel I have been living in ever since I was born. In other words, wouldn't that be changing the very essence of who I am? I have no interest in that type of magic. Eugene wasn't quite ready to say that he had believed Balzac, but at the very least, Balzac had seemed sincere at that moment. That said, could Eugene really bring himself to trust Balzac unconditionally? Should he trust Balzac's information and keep the surrendered Balzac at his side, when he might still betray them at the crucial moment? On top of that, in the end, wasn't the Demon King of Incarceration Balzac's master? What does the Demon King of Incarceration think about this matter? Eugene eventually asked. He doesn't care at all, Balzac replied with an expression that read, "Isn't it only natural? This whole incident is being orchestrated by Edmund alone. Edmund is the Coachella tribe's greatest protector. No, in fact, he's closer to being the lord of the Coachillas. Are you saying that you consider the tribal territories of Samar as part of the Devildom of Helmuth?" Ivatar said with an expression of disbelief. Balzac nodded and continued. "I'm aware that the tribes have shared a long history with the rainforest itself. However, honestly speaking, if the countries of the continent had been allowed to exert a stronger influence on the rainforest, the history of the tribes in this rainforest would have been cut short long ago." Reluctantly, Ivatar nodded. "I hate to admit it, but you are correct. The powerhouses of the continent have always held ambitions for our vast forest. If the Demon King of Helmuth hadn't spoken out about preserving the forest and our freedom, this forest would have already been converted into cities hundreds of years ago." Eugene had also heard this story before. At some point in the past, Helmuth had begun to support the independence of the rainforest tribes. This was in order to prevent the countries of the continent from conquering the forest and exploiting its natives. The biggest beneficiary of this support had been the Coachella tribe, a great tribe that lived in the depths of the forest. The savage, cruel, and isolationist Coachella tribe had grown even larger with Helmuth's support. Eugene was silent for a few moments as he recalled something. Although he didn't really want to admit it, it was true that because the Demon King of Incarceration had taken such a position that the rainforest hadn't gone through any drastic changes for the past 300 years. Even though 300 years had passed, the forest still retained its original form, and the natives continued to occupy the forest. Eugene recalled how Raizakia had managed to tie his existence to the land of the rainforest. If the forest were to disappear, that connection would be lost. However, even if that did happen, it wouldn't mean that Raizakia would somehow disappear from the dimensional rift he was in. But it would mean that Raizakia wouldn't be able to return to this world so easily. Conversely, it would also make it hard for anyone in this world to find a way to reach Raizakia. This is all just speculation for now, Eugene reminded himself. Because the forest had remained in its untouched state, its connection with Raizakia had been maintained. As long as someone found the right method, they would be able to reach Raizakia through that connection. Eugene looked down at Akasha with narrowed eyes. Eugene would be able to find Raizakia relatively easily due to the draconic spell that Ariartel had given him. However, even without that draconic spell, Eugene was sure he would have been able to find a way to reach Raizakia somehow. After all, hadn't Sienna already said as much? Sienna had told him that once he reached a place that had a connection with the dimensional rift, Akasha would show a reaction. In other words, as long as the forest had remained intact and the condition of getting his hands on Akasha was met, Eugene would have been able to find Raizakia somehow. Yet if the forest had no longer existed, even if he had gotten his hands on Akasha, Eugene wouldn't have been able to find Raizakia. That would mean he couldn't save Sienna. Just what does the Demon King of Incarceration want? Eugene muttered as he rubbed his stiff cheeks in confusion. This wasn't the first time something so suspiciously helpful had occurred to him. Yet the Demon King of Incarceration was a demon king. This was an undeniable fact. Eugene knew all too well what kind of terrible things the Demon King of Incarceration had gotten up to 300 years ago. The Demon King of Incarceration had slaughtered the dragons alongside the Demon King of Destruction, and together with the other demon kings he had started the war. Black wizards following the orders of the Demon King had overthrown nations, and his armies of demon folks and demonic beasts had flooded the continent. While the Demon Kings themselves didn't move from Helmuth, the power of the Demon Kings had steadily eaten away at the continent. But what about the current era? The Demon King of Incarceration had the opportunity to achieve a complete victory in the war. He had defeated all the heroes who had come to challenge him and had been on the brink of extinguishing the world's hope. Yet he hadn't done so. Was it really because of the oath? Had a promise whose contents weren't even publicly known really opened up an era of peace? The Devildom had simply become just another empire, and the Demon King its emperor. And that wasn't all. The Demon King of Incarceration was aware that Eugene was Hamel. He also knew that Christina was a niece. He had even seen Molin personally. Yet when meeting with the enemies who had come the closest to defeating him in the past, the Demon King had shown them kindness instead of hostility. I can't go so far as to say that I know what my lord, the Demon King, desires, Balzac added. However, I do know this much. Because of the existence of the Demon King of Incarceration, all those countries apart from Helmuth are nothing more than pieces of land that can be conquered at any time. In fact, the Demon King of Incarceration most likely doesn't have much interest in protecting the peace of the continent. Apart from Helmuth, which he directly rules over, that is. So you're saying that's why he's ignoring this situation? Eugene raised an eyebrow. Well, for now, let's assume that what you're saying is the truth, that Edmund really is the black wizard behind this scheme and he wants to become a Demon King. If he were to succeed, that would mean that the Demon King of Incarceration would obtain a Demon King who was bound to serve him. In the end, Helmuth's strength will grow even. Balzac interrupted to correct Eugene. There's a slight difference in the situation. If Edmund manages to complete the ritual, his body and soul, his entire being will cease to be Edmund Kodrith, a Demon King. No, if you look at the scale of the ritual, the value of his sacrifices and the power used to fuel it, he will become a greater Demon King. So the Demon King of Incarceration, Eugene trailed off in hesitation. Balzac shrugged. Well, who knows? While I do think your suspicions raise a good point, Sir Eugene, I still have to ask, does the Demon King of Incarceration really need to do anything? I have a hunch that, regarding the Demon King of Incarceration, he doesn't really care whether or not Edmund Kodrith succeeds in becoming a Demon King. Eugene found it extremely hard to believe those words. Similarly, he also found it impossible to trust Balzac. Lovelian, aware of Eugene's suspicion, took a step forward and addressed Balzac. Black Tower Master, if you really are innocent, would you be willing to accept restraints? If they're within reason, Balzac confirmed with a nod. Lovelian uttered a short incantation and raised his hand. Fwish! A small dagger formed out of mana manifested above Lovelian's palm. I will implant this dagger into your heart, Lovelian explained. You won't feel any discomfort when this magic dagger goes in, but the moment you feel any hostility towards us or try to harm us, your heart will be ripped to shreds. How vicious, Balzac muttered. Lovelian continued, I hope you understand the need to do so. Once Edmund's ritual has failed, the dagger will be pulled out. Though now that I think about it, I think that the condition of feeling any hostility might be a bit ambiguous. There is a possibility that you could betray us without harming us directly and without even feeling the slightest trace of hostility. Because of that, let's add another insurance. The dagger floating above Lovelian's palm split into two. I will give these twin daggers to Sir Eugene instead of myself, Lovelian explained. So even if you don't feel any hostility towards us, the moment that Sir Eugene infuses any mana into the dagger, your heart. Go ahead and implant it, Balzac insisted without showing any signs of distress. Lovelian also found it difficult to understand how Balzac could show such calmness and confidence. I feel like I have never once been able to see through to your true intentions, Lovelian said, shaking his head as he approached Balzac. When the magic dagger was embedded in Balzac's heart, there was no blood, let alone any pain. Lovelian then handed the dagger's twin to Eugene. I could tear your heart into pieces right now, Eugene stated calmly. If that's what you wish, Sir Eugene, then by all means go ahead, Balzac invited. Eugene frowned. How can you say such a thing? Balzac stated confidently, because I know that even if I die here, Sir Eugene, you will stop Edmund. I really don't know why you have such faith in me, Eugene sighed. Balzac just smiled. As the hero, aren't you the only one who can stop Edmund from becoming a Demon King? You could hear the unconditional trust within these words. Eugene clicked his tongue and put away the dagger. A blade of wind then cut apart the restraints binding Balzac's limbs. I forgot to ask you an important question, Eugene suddenly recalled. What is your secret desire? Although it's not really a big deal, I hope you can wait until we've succeeded in our mission. Please allow me to tell you then, Balzac sincerely requested. Eugene grumbled. The fact that you don't want to tell me right now only makes me more curious about what it is. Instead of responding, Balzac just put on his glasses with a wry smile. The next day, ahead of the huge advancing army, Eugene's party left the capital of the Zoran tribe early in the day. They were leaving in order to inspect the Zoran tribe's northern frontier, which had been encroached on by the Cochillas while Ivatar was away from the tribe. Balzac was the one to propose this plan. Even though he had sworn an oath and had a dagger embedded into his heart, the party still didn't fully trust Balzac. As such, they needed to see the earth vein that had been encroached on by the Cochillas with their own eyes in order to confirm the truth of Edmund's ritual. As I told you yesterday, they're taking advantage of the earth veins that flow throughout this forest. By twisting and redirecting the mana flowing through the earth veins, Edmund is collecting the souls of those who have died in this war as sacrifices. The blood and souls that sink into the land are being led to Edmund by the twisted flow of the earth veins, Balzac explained on the way there. The previous day, Balzac had fully described the contents of the ritual to them. Balzac continued, during their conquests, the Cochillas have been erecting bone towers made up of human bones. These human bone towers are devices that fuel the ritual. However, now that things have come to this point, it would be pointless to destroy the human bone towers. From the moment the human bone towers were built, the flow of the earth veins was already twisted. If that's the case, can't we just correct the flow by destroying them? Eugene asked. Even if we manage to destroy a few of the devices, that will only stop the blood and souls of a few dozen of the deceased from being used as sacrifices. Moreover, the Demon King of Incarceration's dark power is being used to fuel this part of the spell, so no matter what we do, we cannot reverse the flow of the earth veins. With a glance at Eugene, Balzac slowly continued speaking. Of course, I do have access to the same channels as Edmund. If I were to do the same as Edmund, as long as I used dozens, no, considering the difference in our capabilities, as long as I offered twice as many sacrifices as Edmund is offering, then yes, I should be able to shut down the flow. Eugene asked sarcastically, you're not saying that because you really think I'll give you permission to do so, are you? Of course not, Balzac denied. I believe there is no way you would permit such a thing, Sir Eugene, and I would also prefer not to use live sacrifices. Haven't I said as much to you before? Not all black wizards are focused on necromancy and willing to use human sacrifices. However, it was important to note that Balzac had said he could do it. For this entire morning, Balzac had searched for the eyes that Edmund had hidden within the capital. Balzac had pointed out those individuals who had obtained strength or affluence by using their souls as collateral, following which Ivatar had executed them without showing even a shadow of a doubt. In addition to those, they had also found the familiars hiding on the outskirts of the capital. There were no longer any of Edmund's eyes remaining in the capital. But that alone wouldn't have any influence on the outcome of their mission. Edmund had already found out that Eugene's party had come to the aid of the Zoran tribe and that Balzac Ludbeth, his fellow mage of incarceration, was cooperating with them. This meant that Edmund would be left with no choice but to make haste. As the hero, Eugene might still be able to foil his ritual. Or perhaps Balzac might try to seize control of the ritual by offering up his own sacrifices. To destroy the ritual, we will need to destroy the central location where the twisted earth veins are sending their flow of mana. But, at that site, Edmund, along with Vladimir, will be the one maintaining the ritual, Balzac warned. A black wizard who had signed a contract with a demon king and a magic staff that, just like Akasha, had been created using a whole dragon heart. In other words, we won't be able to disrupt the ritual unless we can completely destroy either Edmund or Vladimir, one of the two. Since he can no longer afford to continue making slow and steady preparations for the ritual, Edmund should also be hurrying to complete the ritual, Balzac surmised. That means we'll need to confront them head-on, Eugene grunted. Yes, Balzac nodded. Since they've already secured enough earth veins, losing a few won't hurt them, but what they really need are the blood and souls. If we confront them head-on, Edmund should also come out to meet us. Edmund no longer had any reason to stay in the background. After dispersing the rest of Coachella tribe's grand army to secure the remaining earth veins, Edmund himself would be able to take part in the war. He could appear in person, quickly clear an entire battlefield and obtain some of the necessary blood and souls. What about destroying the earth veins first, then advancing on the central location? Cyan, who had been silently listening, proposed this suggestion, only for Eugene to shake his head and explain. If this ritual simply relied on draining the land, that might work, but with Edmund now taking action himself, seizing control of the earth veins is no longer that important. The more that they have secured, the better, but if it comes down to it, they can still proceed with the ritual without any of that. Cyan complained. Like I thought, shouldn't we have brought the knights from the Lionheart clan with us? In the end, it turned out just as we had initially guessed. Hector, that traitorous bastard, was also in cahoots with Edmund Codrith. The mess you had left was leaked, and now Edmund is making use of a modified version. Eugene sighed. Really now? At that time, how could I know that things would turn out like this? Also, now that things have gotten to this point, can't you consider how long it would take to go and bring back the knights of the Lionheart clan? Cyan put on a puzzled expression after hearing Eugene's response. He might be saying this and that as an excuse, but in the end, didn't this mean he just didn't want to get the clan involved? Cyan could also understand why Eugene might have that opinion. Cyan himself didn't want to see the sight of someone from their clan shedding their blood and collapsing. However, the Lionhearts are a martial clan, Cyan thought. They were a clan of knights. So when the time came for it, none of them should hesitate to go to war. If their blood must be shed to do what is right, the Lionhearts should be the first to bleed before anyone else could. That was the sort of chivalry that had been instilled into Cyan by Ancilla and Gilead ever since he was a child, and it was also part of the family commandments that had been passed down from their ancestor, the Great Vermouth. But still, Cyan glanced at Eugene, who was riding on the back of a summoned beast. This might be stating the obvious, but the spilled blood that Cyan didn't want to see included the blood from his siblings. Whether it was Seal, who wasn't here with them, or Eugene, who was right next to him, he didn't want to see either of them bleeding out in front of him. Instead of the two losing any blood, he would rather it be. Hold on, Cyan suddenly had a thought. He didn't know about Seal, but Cyan found it impossible to imagine the sight of Eugene losing any blood. Also, the next patriarch isn't Eugene. It's me, Cyan reminded himself. If Eugene was the one who had been selected as the next patriarch, Cyan would certainly have been prepared to shed his blood for Eugene. However, wasn't Cyan the next patriarch rather than Eugene? Even though he had suggested to Eugene that he become the patriarch several times before now, hadn't he just been met with refusals that were accompanied by acts of violence? Cyan thought with some relief. Although I might be willing to shed blood for you as the one who will become the next patriarch, I can't allow myself to bleed so easily. In his opinion, this was only natural. Without Ivatar there, the trees of the forest weren't opening a path for them, but thanks to Lovelian's summoned mounts and Melkith calling upon the spirits of the land, they were able to travel plenty fast. They soon reached the northern frontier of the Zoran tribe, where the battle had taken place. All the corpses had been retrieved right after the battle, so there wasn't any remaining scent of blood. The human bone towers, which had been built after the battle was over, had also been knocked over by the Zorans in the process of collecting the bodies. However, just like Balzac had said, it was pointless to collapse the human bone towers after they were erected. The blood and souls of the retrieved corpses had already sunk into the ground and been sent to Edmund by the twisted flow of the earth veins. I really hate black magic, Melkith grumbled. Even in this jungle, she was still wearing high heels and tight denim jeans that were also fashionably ripped. The ground here doesn't have any remaining spirits of the land. The moment that the earth veins were twisted, the spirits all left this place. Janos is also feeling extremely enraged by all this, Melkith said as she stroked the ground with a stern expression. So you can't correct the flow of the earth veins, even with a spirit king's power? Eugene asked. Melkith shook her head. It's impossible. Just like Balzac said, the earth veins have already been irreversibly twisted, with its flow leading to an entirely different direction. Do you know what that means? Unless we can destroy the ritual, the land here will die. In fact, they could already sense that the trees and grasses here were dry enough for there to be a noticeable difference compared to other areas of the forest. And the soil here was so parched it was as if there had been a drought. Although they're all currently trying to hold on with the remains of their original vitality, It won't be long before everything here dries up. The grass will wither, the leaves will leave, and this forest will slowly die. Hold on, the leaves will leave? My amazing sense for puns surprises even me, Malkuth declared proudly. Eugene tightly gritted his teeth in anger. Since when did Malkuth become such an airhead? Damn it. Eugene had suddenly been reminded of a similar conversation he had had with Seal a few years ago. Even thinking about it now, Eugene couldn't help but feel embarrassed and ashamed. He had spouted such a pun at that time only because he had felt the urge to say something. What was even more embarrassing for Eugene was that the moment Malkuth had said those words, Eugene actually had the same pun running through his head. So when Malkuth finally said that pun out loud, he had almost burst out laughing unconsciously. The techniques that were used here are no different from what Balzac described. Lovelian, who had been carefully examining the ground, reported after he was finished with his inspection. Malkuth also agreed with his opinion. Christina silently thought, "What do you think, sister?" Anise also shared her conclusions. There are still traces of black magic and dark powers here. Although it's possible to purify what's here, it would be futile to try and correct the twisting of the earth veins with divine magic. Having confirmed these facts personally, they couldn't help but feel their suspicions towards Balzac lessening. Chapter 283, Balzac Ludbeth 3. The pair of eyes gazing out from between the gap shifted. After having stopped on Eugene for a few seconds, the eyes turned to look at the rest of the people there. Then the eyes stopped once more on Christina. Eugene's instinctive response to this unexpected appearance was to think, "What the hell is this?" He had only met those eyes for a few moments, but Eugene could still feel a chill running down his spine. Unconsciously, Eugene took a step forward. Even though that was all he had done, the prickling sensation coming from his skin in response to that movement was the first sign of the threat lying in front of him. He sensed a terrifyingly sinister dark power coming from those eyes. So he was sure that this person was involved with black magic, but there was something else familiar about it. Right at that moment, the pillar of soil that had risen up from the ground suddenly shattered apart as something leaped out from inside. The explosion threw Eugene off guard for a few moments. No, rather than throwing him off guard, Eugene had actually been overwhelmed by the pressure, even if it was only for a few seconds. Was it due to the figure's strength? No, it wasn't anything like that. Instead, what had overwhelmed Eugene was the figure's terrible hatred and killing intent. This hatred and killing intent were so intense it felt like it wouldn't stop even after killing everyone in this world, and it shot past Eugene before rushing at Christina. Christina was neither a knight nor a warrior. Having been personally instructed by Raphael, she did possess a certain level of combat capability, but her role as a cleric meant she was someone who assisted the knights and the warriors from the rear. However, the truth was, even if she had been an exceptional knight or a warrior, she still wouldn't have been able to react in time to this situation she was faced with. Struck by a tide of bewilderment and distress, Christina's body was frozen stiff. It wasn't just Christina. Even Anise, who also shared her body, was astonished and at a loss when she saw the same thing as Christina. The rage and killing intent of the figure were directed at Christina's neck. Its hand, which was swung like a blade, was about to tear out Christina's throat, but just then Eugene barely managed to intervene. Clang! The collision took place right in front of Christina. Instead of pulling Christina away in order to protect her, Eugene had hastily pushed her backward. Ah! As she staggered backward, Christina let out a slightly belated scream. Had Eugene been even the slightest bit late with his intervention, that hand would have torn apart Christina's throat. Eugene glared at the hand that he had just barely managed to catch. The hand he was holding was so cold it didn't seem human. Eugene felt like he was holding onto a block of ice. So that was why the figure had seemed familiar. This hand had calluses from the rough work it had been put to. The fingers were thick and knotted, and the back of the hand was crisscrossed with all kinds of scars. I had heard that she looked similar, the owner of the hand said without looking at Eugene, who was blocking his way forward. His piercing eyes, in a face that had been twisted into a grimace, were fixed on Christina, who was standing behind Eugene with her hands clasped over her mouth. But they looked so much alike that I couldn't help throwing myself at her. "You're Christina Rogerus, aren't you? Could you truly be her?" Eugene looked at the twisted grimace on the figure's face. He noted the ferocious eyes, the scar that ran diagonally across the face, and another one that cut across the bridge of his nose. There were also several other minor scars. Then came those eyes that were filled with the man's murderous intent and hatred, his twisted smile, his shaggy bangs, and his hair at the back that had been casually tied up into a ponytail because it was too annoying to take care of. But that would make no sense. No matter how you think about it, it shouldn't be possible. It's been 300 years. That's a whole 300 years after all. But now, after 300 years have passed, how could you, Christina Rogerus, the saint of this era, have that face? Why does your face so resemble Anise, that bitch who deserves to be torn to pieces over and over again? The man said with a snark. Eugene and Anise were very familiar with this man's face. Christina, who had seen Anise's memories, also recognized his face. The appearances of Sienna's former comrades had been recorded in Arotha's Royal Library of Akron, on the top floor within Sienna's hall. Mare, who had been stationed there as Sienna's familiar, and Lovelian, Melkith and Balzac, who were all tower masters, also recognized who that face belonged to. Even Cyan, who had seen the statue of the man now erected at the Lionheart main estate, recognized who this man was. Could you actually be Anise? The Death Knight that had been raised from Hamel's corpse asked with a laugh. Having realized who this was, Anise screamed from within Christina's head. The Death Knight. She had heard the story from Eugene some time ago. However, now that Anise saw him in person, she couldn't help but let out such a cry. This Death Knight that had been raised from a corpse. 300 years ago, Anise had seen countless such undead. The wars of that era had been so terrible because even death could not guarantee one's eternal rest. Many knights and warriors who had lost all hope of victory and had feared death had sold their dignity and souls to the black wizards and demon folks. Those with poorer skills had become lowly undead once they had died, while those who had been publicly renowned as strong individuals became Death Knights after they died. Death Knights were made by resurrecting a deceased body using black magic and tying the soul, which was being called to leave this world, back into the body. Anise had heard that a Death Knight had been created from Hamel's corpse. However, since Hamel's soul had already been reincarnated and was here in a different body, just who on earth was the soul that had been implanted into the body of this Death Knight? Eugene squeezed out as he tried to swallow back his nausea. He had already seen a Death Knight that had been made from his own corpse a few years back, so it was easier to regain his composure this time. Who the hell are you? The Death Knight Eugene had met at that time had claimed himself to be the stupid Hamel, but it was actually an imperfect imitation that had been made after settling on the soul of an unknown lycanthrope. Although it had been able to at least partially imitate the muscle memories that had been left in Hamel's body, it had actually been a completely different being with none of Hamel's personality from his previous life. Hamel Dinez, the Death Knight replied. It seemed that the Death Knight this time wouldn't introduce himself as the stupid Hamel. He finally turned his glare away from Christina to stare at Eugene, who was standing in front of him. That gray hair, those golden eyes, you look like that son of a bitch Vermouth, the Death Knight muttered. I have to say it's quite amazing to still see such a sight even after 300 years. That bastard really did give birth to litters of pups like an actual bitch. But how did all of the many brats that he spawned manage to inherit his gray hair and golden eyes? Eugene's nausea deepened. Although he really didn't want to admit this fact, unlike the Death Knight from last time, the Death Knight that was in front of him now, he really did manage to imitate Hamel extremely well. So then your name is Eugene Lionheart, correct? The one who, like Vermouth, was acknowledged by the Holy Sword. Although this is my first time seeing you, I've heard a bit about you from my master, the Death Knight revealed. His master? I've heard that you're pretty strong, the Death Knight continued. The world has even been calling you the second coming of Vermouth. Do you know what was my first thought when I came back to life like this was? Plunge. The Death Knight's hand flexed. His hand, which was as hard and as cold as a block of ice, began to exert heavy pressure on Eugene's own hand. I decided that I needed to wipe out all the seeds that were left behind by that bastard Vermouth, the Death Knight hissed. Then comes Molin, who, surprisingly for him, went ahead and founded his own kingdom. I'll eradicate that fool's royal family as well. The increasing pressure began to push Eugene's hand backward. With each sinister curse that the Death Knight spat, the expression on Eugene's face slowly disappeared. One by one, with each word that it uttered, the Death Knight's rage and killing intent seemed to continuously grow as it attempted to swallow Eugene. What's slightly unfortunate is that Anise and Sienna didn't give birth to any brats, the Death Knight sighed. I didn't know about Anise, but I thought for sure that Sienna would leave something behind. Eugene wasn't consumed by the pressure. Even in the face of the Death Knight's rage and killing intent, he managed to persist. By now, his face didn't have any trace of emotion or the slightest expression left on it. The Death Knight suddenly recalled something. Come to think of it, I've heard that you're Sienna's heir, right? Would you happen to know something about her? Sienna, that yappy bitch, secretly took advantage of me. 1. Hey, Eugene's lips finally parted. The hand that was blocking the Death Knight's own was no longer getting pushed back. As all emotion seemed to disappear from them, an eerie light began to shine in Eugene's eyes. Don't you dare say another word, Eugene hissed. Eugene didn't spout any curses back at the Death Knight. He felt like his breath was getting caught in his chest and it was painful to even try and say anything. It felt like a knife had been lodged in his throat. His head was burning as if it had been dipped in hellfire, and a high-pitched squeal was ringing in his ears. As for his chest and heart, Eugene refused to give it any more thought. Letting out a gasp of air, Eugene lowered the hand he had raised up in a block in front of him. Pong! The moment Eugene lowered his hand, his other fist was sent flying forward. The Death Knight reacted immediately and blocked Eugene's fist with his own hands, but his whole body was still blown backward by the blow. Eugene's outstretched fist tingled. While shaking his wrist lightly, Eugene marched forwards. But Eugene wasn't the only one who was furious after hearing what the Death Knight had to say. Christina grabbed onto her rosary as she cried out, "Sir Eugene." At some point, Lovelian, who had been forced to listen to such insults being leveled against his grandmaster, had also pulled out his staff and was holding it in his hands. Melkith and Balzac were also finishing up their own preparations to attack the Death Knight, and even Cyan had drawn his sword. "Please stay out of this," Eugene snarled out without even turning back to look at them. Eugene didn't want to try and understand what the Death Knight meant by those words he had just said, nor did he have any intention of replying to them. This fight, no, executing this son of a bitch, was something that Eugene needed to do on his own. After all, that body had once belonged to Eugene in the past. He didn't know whose soul now dwelled in his corpse that had been raised as a Death Knight, but that guy, he was actually talking about himself as if he were Hamel. Yet although he was referring to himself as Hamel, he was saying things that the real Hamel would never say. But why? Looking at its personality, the Death Knight's persona seemed to be a projection of the body's memories. So why was it saying such things? Eugene didn't bother to ask any questions. His own rage and killing intent were stronger than any desire to look into these questions. Eugene was no longer expressionless or emotionless. His eyes had lit up like those of a mad beast, and indiscriminate killing intent was surging forth from his body. "Ho!" The Death Knight, who had been pushed back quite a distance, muttered in surprise as he shook his hand. Even though he hadn't had much room for acceleration, Eugene's fist had been quite heavy. And now look at what Eugene was doing. Could a child born in a peaceful era like this truly be as vicious as Eugene currently seemed? "You're nothing like the rest of the brats born these days," the Death Knight said with a chuckle as he clenched and unclenched his fist. "Since the Lionhearts and the Tower Masters from Aroth have interfered, please intercept them." That had been the request the Death Knight received from Edmund. The capital of the Kachia tribe, which was where the Death Knight and Edmund had been located at that time, was far from here, but as this was a site where the earth veins had been twisted, the Cochillas had kept a record of these coordinates. As long as he had the coordinates, Edmund was able to send the Death Knight here, as it could be considered a type of undead summons. The Death Knight, who was burning with an artificially induced hatred and desire for vengeance, hadn't refused Edmund's request. As he believed that he himself was Hamel, the Death Knight held a desire to get his revenge on all those who had betrayed him. And that included Vermouth's descendants, the Lionheart clan. Their presence here alone would have been enough to arouse the Death Knight's thirst for blood. But then he had seen the saint of this era, who closely resembled that disgusting serpent Anise. The Death Knight licked his lower lip as he grabbed the hilt of the sword at his waist. When Eugene had told the others not to interfere, the emotions that were contained in those words were so bloodthirsty and dire that everyone remained standing where they were, staring at Eugene's back. Of course, none of them allowed themselves to relax completely. Everyone was ready to provide Eugene with support in case of an emergency. Eugene didn't look back. He kept to a walk rather than a run. As he slowly approached the Death Knight, Eugene also slipped a hand into his cloak. Eugene's fingertips brushed over the handles of the countless weapons within. They skimmed over the demon's spear luentos. They slid over the annihilation hammer Jiggalath. They brushed over the devouring sword Asphal, the thunderbolt Pernoa, and the dragon spear Carbos. Eugene's hand hovered over the holy sword Altair for a few moments, but eventually, it was drawn to another weapon. As Eugene's fingertips were about to wrap around the hilt of the moonlight sword, right at that moment, WNOD moved of its own volition and shoved itself into Eugene's hand. Hamel! A cry rang out inside Eugene's head. In the face of Tempest's expression of his pure and heartfelt rage, Eugene's lips arced into a smile. Fine then, Eugene agreed. His fingers wrapped around WNYD's hilt. The moment its silverish-blue blade was drawn from his cloak, the gust of wind summoned by the sword of its own volition sent Eugene's hair and the hem of his cloak fluttering. Eugene quietly muttered, "If it's you, then you should have a pretty good idea of what I'm feeling right now." A huge gust of wind proceeded to wash over Eugene's back. Through this violent storm, Tempest was letting out his own roar of rage. Eugene lifted WNYD high and glared at the Death Knight. WNYD. Tempest, you're also on the list of people I want to kill. The Death Knight let out his own roar as he returned Eugene's grin. Screech. As the Death Knight's sword was drawn from its scabbard, black flames wrapped around the blade. As this flame-like aura around the sword proceeded to swell up to a huge size, it was dark power, not mana, that fueled this growth. While continuing to expand his ominous and dark-colored sword force, the Death Knight charged at Eugene. Purple flames engulfed Eugene's body. The sparks that flew out from him looked like a lion's mane. Clang! Dark power collided against these flames. A storm of wind swept forward over Eugene's back. The Death Knight swung his sword at this storm that he shouldn't even be able to cut, and the chopping slash tore straight through the storm of wind. Hamel! Tempest shouted. This thing doesn't have the soul of a human. It's just a monster made by mixing together the souls of demonic beasts. That sounds about right, Eugene muttered to himself from within the torn-apart storm. Eugene was convinced of Tempest's words by the swordplay that the Death Knight had displayed just now. The Death Knight that had been created using a lycanthrope's soul hadn't been able to reproduce Hamel's swordsmanship. However, the current Death Knight was able to perfectly reproduce his swordsmanship. Among the countless varieties of demonic beasts, the doppelgangers were the only ones that could perfectly reproduce their opponent's movements. However, in the end, their copying skills were just at the level of imitating what could be seen. They weren't able to copy what lay below the surface. Yet this Death Knight was even able to perfectly recreate his Azura rampage. It seems they managed to perfectly reproduce the memories left within my corpse by amplifying a doppelganger's mimicry. But who was the one who had made this version of Death Knight? Was it Amelia Merwin? Had that fucking bitch left her desert and come to this rainforest? The Death Knight had said something about his master, so he was probably talking about Amelia. But after having completely reproduced his memories, had this Death Knight really decided to take a black wizard as their master? This son of a bitch dares, Eugene growled as he spun WE in his hand. Bam! Eugene blocked the sword force that had slashed at his body. Then without being pushed back, Eugene drove his sword forward instead. The instant their two slashes collided, Eugene's sword wove around the Death Knight's blade and slipped past. While appearing to follow the flow of force, WNYD was thrust into an opening. Yet the Death Knight also refused to be pushed back. While parrying each probing slash that came at him, he carefully watched Eugene's movements. He noticed that the position of Eugene's feet was constantly changing. It seemed that his opponent was also good at shifting his weight. Being able to fire off a slash from a posture where you usually wouldn't be able to swing a sword allowed Eugene to create numerous opportunities to attack. What's with this bastard? The Death Knight thought with a twitch of his brow. He admitted that Eugene deserved to be called the second coming of Vermouth. However, he could feel a strong sense of incongruity coming from Eugene's sword techniques. They weren't just at the level of being excellent. They seemed to have already reached perfection. A perfection that was even comparable to the Death Knight's own skills, which he had inherited from Hamel. But how? He had heard all about the Lionheart clan from the traitor of their family, Hector Lionheart. He had been told that among the Knights of the Black Lion, the knightly order that Vermouth had created, there was someone who had inherited Hamel's secret techniques. Eugene Lionheart had also managed to discover Hamel's grave and claimed to have inherited Hamel's secret techniques from there. But that only made the Death Knight want to kill Eugene even more. How dare the detestable Vermouth steal what he himself had failed to leave behind and even dare to teach it to his descendants? No matter what the case may be, to think that he can actually use my skills at this level, without even having learned from me personally. No, could it just be because Vermouth managed to pass them down well? Even though the Death Knight had already guessed the plausible reason for Eugene's swordsmanship, the sense of incongruity refused to disappear. Eugene's swordsmanship wasn't just at the level of having accepted his inheritance. It was like looking into a mirror. A mirror. Such a thought only made the Death Knight's hatred grow even stronger. To think that Eugene would still dare to imitate someone when standing right in front of them. Even though the Death Knight had already gone so far as to admit that he was Hamel. For Eugene to still insist on using Hamel's swordsmanship even with that. There should be a limit as to how much you can insult someone, the Death Knight spat out through gritted teeth, a twisted scowl on his face. Let's just see if he can continue copying me, the Death Knight thought. The Death Knight's sword shook. His overflowing dark power began to condense and cling to his sword. Hamel's swordsmanship didn't possess a clear form. While there was a guiding flow to it, in order to use his sword style, you needed to know how to make alterations when needed. The Death Knight was currently making just such a change to his swordplay. The sword in his hand had become a killing sword designed solely for the sake of executing Eugene. All of his power was being condensed into a single slash. Just as Eugene had borrowed the strength of the storm, the Death Knight was amplifying the strength of his slash with his own dark power. Yet if it was simply dark power alone, his efforts might just add up to a forceful push. But the Death Knight wasn't using just any ordinary dark power. The Death Knight was making use of the dark power that reinforced his own dead body. By concentrating that dark power into one place, the Death Knight could generate an explosive force. Crackle. Lightning began to mix in with the flames surrounding Eugene. The moment the Death Knight's concentrated slash was about to be released at Eugene, Eugene's sword, which was accelerated by the lightning, pierced through the center of the Dark Knight's slash. What on earth? The Death Knight gasped. He had had no choice but to retreat. If the Death Knight had insisted on taking the blow, one side of his chest would have been pierced through. As a raised corpse, his body wouldn't die even if his chest was pierced. But the Death Knight, having retained all the memories from his previous life, couldn't allow himself to be pierced by that sword. He had no intention of allowing himself to be injured by Vermouth's descendants. The Death Knight felt forced to ask, "Are you truly a descendant of Vermouth?" Eugene's sword and how he had perfectly grasped where the Death Knight was swinging his sword, what he was aiming at and how he intended to attack. The Death Knight couldn't understand how Eugene could know all these, so he couldn't help but ask. Eugene didn't respond to the question. Instead, his sword and the storm danced together once more.